Good morning, everybody. We are excited to be out in the garden again today, and on what turned out to be a really sunny day. So this is the workshop about composting anywhere. So as in other sessions, please put your name, your group, and your email into the chat box as you come in. I'm going to keep everybody muted as we go through, but we will accept questions throughout the session, and please feel free to ask them at any time, and then we'll leave a little bit of time at the end as well. So thank you to Dan and Tyler who are in the garden, and we're going to go ahead and get started and learn all about composting.
Hi everybody, Dan here in the Franklin Permaculture Garden on a beautiful day. Hope wherever you are getting some sunshine today. So we're going to be talking about composting, and my hope is that you leave our session today either feeling ready to start composting, or if you are already composting and have some troubleshooting that you want to go over, that we have an opportunity to go over that. I think that composting to me is one of the most important strategies for overall sustainability. It's something that we can all be doing, and it's really quite easy. And to be quite honest, I think that the process is really enjoyable as well. So, just to step back and look at the broader context for why composting matters. When you actually just, put your food scraps into the garbage, they go to a landfill or an incinerator, and they generally end up either as methane gas, which is potent greenhouse gas. So if we want to reduce that greenhouse gas effect, we need to be doing some composting. Now, aside from that, we also are losing a lot of really vital nutrients. Whenever you put something in the garbage that is an organic material, those nutrients are lost to the system of food production, and they are not recycled back in. So when composting, we're able to really cycle our nutrients to create closed loop systems that either will end up in our garden or at a farm or somewhere else where they may have some function. So from a climate change perspective, it's really crucial, because not only actually are we reducing methane when we compost, we're actually putting carbon back into the soil and letting it capture that carbon. Compost is a fantastic source of really stable carbon, and it's one of the best ways that we can capture and cycle it back into the soils to where it will be held for a long term. So for me, the joy of composting is really in seeing an incredible biological process take place in front of our very eyes. It goes through a variety of stages, and each stage to me is incredibly fascinating. When you first make your compost heap, you end up creating this bacterial heaven, if all goes well, and we'll talk about how to do that. And your compost will actually heat up to 140, 150 degrees, to the point where if you stick your hand in, it's actually quite hot. It won't quite burn you, but it'll be incredibly hot. In fact, there are ways of even heating buildings using compost, which is incredible. And then it goes through this fungal stage and this stage with macro biological life, worms and nematodes and all sorts of other things. If you actually come over here, I'm gonna pick up a little bit of compost. We'll talk about what you're seeing in a moment, but I just want to show you, this is a fairly broken down, so this is in the worm stage. I mean, just look at how much life is in there. 1 teaspoon of this compost has billions and billions of bacteria and fungi, and you can see 1 handful there. I think I'm counting about a half dozen or a dozen worms. So, really incredibly rich. And from a gardening point of view, this is what we refer to as black gold. This is invaluable. Whatever kind of soil type you may be starting with, compost will create an incredibly beneficial function. If you have clay soils, really heavy, compact, poorly draining soils, compost will create better drainage. If you have sandy soils that tend to drain too well, that don't hold moisture, compost will act as a sponge in your soils so that you don't have to water as often, so that you don't have to add fertilizers often, because this matrix holds fertility so well. There's so much life in there that's constantly cycling and making nutrients available to plants, that really cycles the whole system. So to me, this is the basis for everything that we do in the garden. We cannot possibly have as lush and productive of a garden as we have without compost. And our goal here in our garden is to eventually create all of our own compost. So we've been doing that. We just actually recently built these 3 bays. I'm going to talk about our system today, but I also want to offer some alternatives because not everyone necessarily wants to have or can afford to build these bins, even though they're quite cheap to build. There's a lot of other ways of going about it. So we're going to touch on vermicomposting, which is worm composting, which can be done indoors or outdoors. And we'll talk about some other low-tech methods of really just burying compost, making it right on the spot in the garden without having any bins at all. So that's my goal. And please feel free to write in with any questions that are specific to you or just something that you've been wondering about. Again, my hope is that we can go through whatever troubleshooting you may have and really demystify the process. So let's start with the basic ingredients of good compost. To make really good compost, you just need 4 things. You need green material, brown material, air, and water, okay? Now let's go through all of those individually. When I say green material, I'm talking about nitrogen-rich materials. That can be anything from your food scraps in your kitchen, to coffee grounds that you pick up at a cafe, to lawn clippings when you're mowing your lawn, whatever it may be. It's usually moist, fairly green materials that are rich in nitrogen. And by the way, it's really easy to find lists of all these. If you Google green materials for compost, you'll see a whole list of them and it'll tell you, how rich they are. But it doesn't really matter. I don't want to get too specific about how much nitrogen, how much carbon, because the purpose of my talk here is to really make it as simple as possible for you to compost at home, wherever you are. Because it really, there are a lot of great services, by the way, out there that help you compost. Like Pedal People is one that I can think of right now. But really, it's something that anyone can do without, even if you don't have any land, if you don't have a backyard, you can still compost right in your apartment, right in your house. Or if you have a tiny backyard, you can be composting. It's something that all of us can be doing. So, okay, let's get back to our 4 basic ingredients. So we have our green materials. Those are the nitrogen-rich materials. Then we have our brown materials. These are our carbon-rich materials. Really, really crucial. Unfortunately, I see a lot of people just putting their kitchen waste into a pile and hoping that, they're composting. And certainly everything will rot, right? Everything wants to break down. So if you do just pile up your kitchen scraps, yes, it will break down into something. The question is, what will it look like and what will happen along the way? If you don't have any of those brown materials, you're going to end up with an anaerobic pile, being without oxygen. It's going to smell horrible, kind of that ammonia smell that just, something is wrong when you're smelling that. So that's where our carbon materials come in. It's really crucial to have them in the mix. And in fact, they're our dominant material in the compost bin. The brown materials can include everything from wood chips, sawdust, wood shavings, shredded paper, dry leaves, hay, all sorts of materials that tend to be kind of on the drier side, tend to be brown, and they're quite easy to source. So when I lived in the Boston area, I had a really small yard. I didn't have a lot of leaves that I could gather, for example. So what I would do there, I contacted a local cabinet maker who lived a couple blocks away from me, and I would go to his shop once or twice a year and pick up a couple big bags of wood shavings that were left over from his work. And every time I would add my kitchen scraps, I would add some of those wood shavings, and that was my source of those brown materials. If you have access to a landscaping company, ask them to dump a bunch of wood chips on your yard, and honestly, that will probably be more than enough for a year or two. If you are gathering leaves in the fall, instead of giving those leaves away, keep them around. You can put them into a bag, you can put them into a bin, put them near your compost bin, and that way throughout the entire year, you'll have some brown material to use. If you work in an office and you shred paper, take a couple bags of that shredded paper home with you, and that will be an adequate supply for probably 6 months or maybe even longer. So the brown materials, you really should have no problem sourcing for free wherever you are. Really, really important to have those. Now, the other two primary ingredients, we have air. So aeration is crucial. If your pile is incredibly compacted, if it's too dense, again, that's going to create an anaerobic pile, which means that the aerobic bacteria, which is so crucial to that first stage of composting, we'll talk a little bit more about that, they're not going to be able to survive in an anaerobic setting. They need oxygen. And so it's really important to kind of have a sense of how aerated your pile is. I'm going to show you how we aerate our piles today. And lastly, the final ingredient is water. Now, really what you're looking for with water is you want everything to be nice and alive, and usually I'm looking for the consistency of roughly a wrung out sponge. So I want to be able to grab some of my material in here. It should look moist, and if I squeeze it, I might get a drop or two of water. I'm not getting in much water at all, but I can see it's quite wet. And again, I don't fuss too much. You know, if it's not exactly the same consistency all the time, that's fine. I come over here maybe once every month, you know, take a look at the compost. I'll make any adjustments I need to make. I'll turn it, and we'll talk about turning in a little bit. And that's really what I'm looking for. I don't want a high maintenance bin. There's enough going on in my life as it is. I don't need to be worrying about my compost. I don't want to be, you know, having nightmares about, you know, my compost getting anaerobic or anything along those lines, right? This should be low maintenance, simple, and most importantly, it should fit into the rhythm of our lives. This should be as easy as brushing your teeth in the morning. Even easier, in fact, I would say. So that's most
Good question coming in, Dan. Is it true that you shouldn't use color newspaper if you are to use paper scraps? And I would add, does it matter if it has ink on it?
That is a great question. Yeah. I should have specified actually on that front. So what I would definitely avoid is colored ink, and most importantly, glossy paper or newspaper. The glossy stuff tends to have a lot of chemical additives. So I would be fine with black ink. The vast majority of ink, pretty much all of it, is soy-based ink these days, fully decomposable, compostable rather. And so if you're just using regular office paper with black ink, I'm not worried about that at all. If there's a little bit of colored ink in there, I wouldn't be worried about that. But certainly if it's majority, you know, colored paper, but especially glossy newspaper, you know, the advertising that you often get in the mail, that junk mail, that's what I would be avoiding at all costs. Otherwise, a little bit of colored ink in there should not have much of an effect.
All right,
great question. Yeah. So let's talk about our process for making these bins. So first of all, when we're piling up, the ratio that I'm usually looking for is 1 part green material to 3 parts brown material. What that basically means is that in my kitchen, I have a bin where I put all of my kitchen scraps. It's, you know, something I usually take it out once every 3 or 4 days. Again, it has to fit into the rhythm of your life. So in your kitchen, try to have a bin that you don't have to necessarily empty out every day, although maybe that's what works for you. I want to go out there once every few days before it gets smelly, but not so often that I'm constantly bothered by it. And whenever I go out and I dump it, I put the same, roughly 2 or 3 times that volume of brown material on there, right on top. So at my house, what I've been using recently is spoiled hay. I bought some bales of spoiled hay last fall for, I think I paid about $2 a bale. So 1 bale is quite a bit. It takes me a while to go through that. So that's what I've been using. But again, whatever you have on hand is fine. I bought spoiled hay mostly to use in my garden, actually, but I've also been using it in my compost. Whatever you have, you generally use about 3 parts brown, maybe even 2 parts brown to 1 part green. So whatever you dump in terms of your kitchen scraps, you want to add double or even triple that volume in brown material right on top. And you're essentially kind of creating a layer cake as you go, right? You have your green materials and you have your brown materials. Now, I don't want to get too deep into the wonkiness of it, but every different material has a different ratio of carbon to nitrogen. And it's nice to know roughly, what you're adding. For example, fresh green grass is roughly 20 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, which is actually kind of evenly balanced between green and brown, versus kitchen scraps, which is more like 8 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. So I guess my point there is that everything's a little different. So it's easy for us to categorize it as green or brown, but the reality is that everything is on a spectrum of really nitrogen rich to really carbon rich. Really carbon rich being wood materials like wood chips, really nitrogen rich being kitchen scraps or coffee grounds, really fresh, tends to be kind of juicier materials. So that's kind of the spectrum. And you want to know roughly where you're falling in that spectrum because, again, it's all about that ratio. But certainly, I'm not going in there. I'm never doing any calculations in my head. I want to just kind of adjust as needed. So once that pile reaches a critical mass, I generally start a new pile. Your minimum pile size should be 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. That's about where we're at here. Maybe, I think we're even bigger than that. We're probably about 4 feet high here. If your pile is smaller than 3 feet cubed, you're not going to really have good results. And I think that that's one of the main issues that I encounter with home composting. People buy these really small bins and they have these, tiny little piles that just are not going to break down rapidly. And that's really the name of the game, is we want to be creating bins that are going to support really rapid decomposition in order for us to really cycle those nutrients quickly. Although some people do have a different kind of more laissez-faire approach, so that might be your style, but for us here, we want to cycle things rapidly, and we're able to go from raw materials to fully finished compost in about 3 months during the warm part of the season. When it's cold out, it takes much longer than that. So let me go through our kind of cycle here. So we have 3 bins. I'll talk a little bit more about infrastructure a little bit later on. Bear with me on those questions for a moment. This is our first bin here. So this is where our fresh material goes. You can see we've been adding mostly weeds in here. There's a lot of leaves, whatever we're pulling out of the garden. Certainly some people come through here and occasionally add their kitchen scraps, but it's mostly kind of just, dead plant matter, mostly weeds this time of year, and leaves from our spring cleanup. We're going to let this sit in here until it heats up. And that's really crucial for us. That initial heating stage, that's what is caused by the thermophilic bacteria. Thermophilic meaning heat-loving. If you have just, roughly that right ratio of carbon to nitrogen, you have really nice, wet, kind of sponge-like compost, the thermophilic bacteria will emerge on their own. You don't have to invite them in. They're already present in the atmosphere. They're present on just about everything, and they'll find their way in on their own. And what they're essentially doing, they're going to start to break down all those nutrients, all of that complex nutrients, and that's what's going to create that heat. Their metabolism is actually what we're feeling. So you can actually get a compost thermometer, and if all things go well, you should be able to kind of stick it in or even stick your hand in. And this is a fairly new pile, so I'm starting to feel some heat. Actually, if I stick my hand down about a foot, I'm definitely feeling some warmth in there already. But I want to wait till I feel it really nice and hot. In fact, you can even get it to the point where it's steaming. That's when you know that you are composting really, really effectively. That thermophilic bacteria is really happy. And the bigger the bin size, or the bigger your compost heap, usually the happier your thermophilic bacteria will be. They like to have a lot of mass. So once that thermophilic stage concludes, that's usually when we're looking to turn the bin and kind of to start that next phase. So after the thermophilic bacteria, usually it'll go through a bit of a fungal process, and there's a lot of different layers. But usually once that kind of starts to cool down, and that takes a couple months usually for us, again, depends on time of year, that's when we're going to turn it. So here we have a 3-bay system, and I'm going to show you guys how we turn our pile in a little bit. This is our freshest material, all from this spring. This material right here in our middle bin, this has been turned once. It was turned early this spring. Most of this was piled up in the fall. And you can see at this point, it is quite well, mostly kind of still very rough, but definitely on its way to becoming soil, especially if I dig down there. And I don't know if you can see, but there's definitely a lot of worm activity at this point. And it smells, I'm not getting any like strange odors. It smells fairly, nice and fresh, like soil. And that's kind of what we're going for.
Dan?
Yes.
Why does the one bin have the green top on it and the others have more of a mesh top?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, okay, so let me segue a little bit into infrastructure, and I'll come back to the turning process when I demonstrate that. So we have these 3 bins here. There's a lot of different bins out there, by the way. And one of the most important things in finding a bin or making your own, and I do encourage you to try to make your own because it's so easy, is really good access to moisture coming in from above, from the rain. And unfortunately, this was our first bin that we built here. We put some of this corrugated plastic on top. You can all see that. This is not a great design, and we've learned our lesson from this. So this, unfortunately, does not let rain in. We did drill some holes thinking, okay, well, maybe we can, get most of the rain to come in if we just drill some holes. And even that's not enough. So at this point, we'd either have to completely pepper it with drill holes, or what we want to do now is actually transition away from corrugated plastic and put more of this hardware cloth, which is on these 2 bins right here. So you can see here, we have, this is called hardware cloth. It's 1/2-inch mesh. You can use chicken wire. We have it on top. We also have it on the sides and the bottom. And the reason that we decided to put it on all sides is because we are in a very public space here, and we were concerned about the potential for wildlife getting into our compost bins. And certainly it is possible that that can happen if it's open. It does somewhat depend on what you're adding to your compost. It tends to be that if you add oily food, meat, fish, dairy, those will be more attractive to particularly rodents, mice, rats, squirrels, than if you're just composting everything else aside from that, garden scraps and kitchen scraps outside of those things. Now, everything will break down. If you add, bones, if you add oily foods, they will break down. And at home, actually, I'm honestly quite indiscriminate. Because over there, I'm actually not quite as concerned. We don't have really any rats. I don't live in a city, so it's fairly rat-free. And the compost bin is far enough away from my home that, if a mouse occasionally gets in or a squirrel gets in, it's not the end of the world. So I don't have it nearly as protected, but this is what a design that we found online. This is called the Fort Knox compost bin, because it is meant to be an urban composting system. So we did coat it on all sides, and it's been pretty effective so far. And this top here is great because it does allow the water to come in from any rain events, and it allows really good aeration. The sides are open, as you can see. It's just the hardware cloth. So there's a lot of air movement, which really helps the decomposition process, but it protects from rodents getting in, because that can definitely be an issue. So Our bins here, the other really important thing I want to point out about them, actually a couple things. One is that they are off the ground, which you don't necessarily need to do, but I do find that that level of aeration on the bottom makes it even quicker to decompose. But functionally, I would say the most important thing is, what do you do about the front here? You need something to prevent the compost from spilling out. So I really like this design that we found with this 4-Knox bin, where we have boards that slide into this little frame here that we have. We just put a couple, I think those are 2x1s there. And we're able to just slide these boards out whenever we need to turn our compost. And we put them in as we build our bin. So this has been really functional for us. So I want to just show you guys real quick how I'm going to turn my bin. I'm turning this bin into our 3rd bin. So this is where it's going to sit, and it's going to probably be there for another month or 2. Once it's fully decomposed, once it looks essentially like soil, then we're going to put it out into the garden. But right now, we want to turn it once more. The turning process is not essential, by the way, but it really does make things go faster. That's really the main advantage. When you turn, what's basically happening is that, first of all, everything that's on the outside perimeter of the bin, you can see right here, this is on the corner, it's dry and it's not really well decomposed. If it was in the middle, it would be much more thoroughly decomposed. So what we're wanting really to do is take everything that's on the perimeter and kind of put it back into the middle. Mix it up, right? And that mixing process will restart decomposition. We'll get that bacteria going again. And another month or 2, and it'll be fully finished. So I'm going to go ahead and start to turn this bin. And while I do that, I'm happy to take some questions. So let me go ahead and work on this. By the way, I'm using a pitchfork here. This is really the best tool for turning a compost. It's nice and wide, and it allows you to really easily do this. Okay, pretty heavy. So, and I should add, when your compost is finished, there's still going to be some undecomposed material in it. Usually what I find are things like eggshells, avocado pits, and what we call compostable plastic. Those tend to take a really long time to break down. In fact, this right here is an example. Here's some decomposable or compostable plastic, which it takes oftentimes a year or 2 to put in. So at my home, even though compostable plastic will break down, I don't add them to my compost bin. I do put those in the trash because I don't want to find forks and knives and plastic stuff like this in my garden, even a year later. So I tend not to include those, but you certainly can if you want to. So that's kind of the turning process. Now I should say there are people who do static composting, which basically means you make your pile and you make sure it's nice and moist, you make sure it's big enough, you make sure that that carbon nitrogen balance is roughly there, and you just leave it be. And it takes longer, sometimes 6 months, sometimes a year before it's really broken down. And the stuff on the very outside perimeter might not be fully decomposed even then, but everything within will be. And that's another way of doing it. It's really simple. And that process actually ends up with creating a slightly different final product. They both look like soil, but if you look at it on a microscopic level, they're actually quite different. A static bin tends to primarily rely on fungal decomposition, especially later on in the process, versus we're relying mostly on bacteria. Now, without getting too geeky, you can use either one anywhere in the garden, but for people who are really trying to kind of dial in their gardening skills, those static bins tend to be really, really good for fruit trees and for other perennials that have a lot of fungal connections in the soil. Versus what we're creating here, this bacterially driven compost, is really excellent for vegetables because vegetables rely primarily on kind of bacteria to access nutrients. So slightly different end products, but honestly, I would say it's more about the rhythm of your life. Do you want to be turning compost? As you can see, you know, it takes a little bit of work. So, you know, this bin will take me about 10 minutes or so to turn. If you don't want to take that time to turn it once or twice, then don't. Just leave it as a static bin, and that's perfectly fine. So it's really up to you what you decide to do. So I want to just pause for a second to see if there's any questions about anything we've talked about thus far. I also want to offer a few other options in terms of how else you might want to compost at your home or in your garden.
Dan, do you ever get fruit flies?
Great question. So let me just actually go over some troubleshooting, including fruit flies. We'll start with that. If you're seeing fruit flies in your compost, usually what that means is that you have too much nitrogen. It's too green heavy, and the fruit flies tend to be attracted by that. Either that or occasionally means that it's too wet. One of those two. If you're seeing fruit flies, or if you are getting an ammonia-like smell, just any smell that doesn't smell good to you, that doesn't smell like rich forest humus, then most likely you have too much green, too much nitrogen. And what you'd want to do is work in some brown materials. Again, that's shredded paper, wood shavings, sawdust, hay, straw, leaves, anything like that will do fine. And that should balance it out quite well. So I would definitely recommend that. That is a really common issue that I see with home composting, is too much green, which creates, you know, fruit fly issues, creates bad smell. And I know a lot of people, you know, they site their compost too far away because they're so used to it smelling bad. This is what my aunt did, for example, at her house. She was so afraid of the smell of compost that she put her compost bin as far away from her house as humanly possible on her property, right on the edge of the woods, which of course meant that she had to walk a good 8 minutes to get to her compost bin every morning or however often she went. And so after a year, she decided, you know what, I don't want to compost anymore. It's too much work. And I was trying to tell her, I'm like, just move it closer and add some brown materials, and you won't have any issues with smell, and you won't have any issues with fruit flies. Again, composting should not smell bad. If it does, something's going wrong. Great question. So a few other troubleshooting issues that you might encounter. If you have just a compost that does not seem to be breaking down, that's just sitting there, that's one of two issues usually. Either it's not moist enough, or it has too much brown material. So if there's too much carbon, too much brown material, then you'd want to balance it out with either your kitchen scraps, or if you want to get it started in a hurry, what you could do is add some blood meal or liquid fertilizer to it. Fish emulsion is another really good one. That's pretty nitrogen rich. Or you can get a bunch of coffee grounds from a cafe, and if you're able to work those in, that will really restart the process and really get it going again. But you also want to just kind of stick your hand in or look at it and see, does it look moist? If it's totally dried out, you gotta get a hose in there. And compost can absorb a lot of water. So you really want to douse it thoroughly, let it all kind of drip through, nice, thoroughly saturated, and then that process should really start to get going again and really get reinvigorated.
Right, I got another question. Can students throw our compostable cups, silverware, and plates into these compost bins on campus?
That's a great question. So we actually have not been advertising that these bins are open to anyone other than folks who are coming into the gardens. We've really just mostly been using these just for garden waste. And that's mostly so that we have a little bit more quality control. If we do open it to the public, of course, then, you know, we're going to get all sorts of things coming in, compostable plastic materials, which will linger for a year or more. We're going to get oily material and other things that will often attract rodents. And even if the rodents can't get in, we don't want them in the garden at all if we can help it. So that's why we have not been inviting others to put their compost here. However, the dining commons, as well as Blue Wall and other locations on campus, they all have compost bins. Those compost bins go to a farm in Greenfield, where they're doing composting on a more industrial scale. And they're not at all concerned there about any kind of compostable plastics or oily materials. They have such huge windrows of compost being created there. And it's, you know, fairly out in the country that they're not at all concerned. Everything gets broken down quite well. So if you are looking to dump your home composting materials somewhere, that's where I would go if you're looking for a place on campus to do so. But you can easily do this at home. Now, if you want to build your own bins, I just want to kind of mention this. I would say the easiest thing to do is to get some free pallets. And for those folks who are not familiar with pallets, these are what shipping is usually, you know, any kind of shipped items usually come on pallets. They look somewhat similar. I wish I had an example here. It's a wooden frame that's raised off the ground. If you check on Craigslist or any place where they're offering free things, if you Google pallets or free pallets, you'll often be able to find a whole bunch of them right in your neighborhood that you can pick up. Pallets make for excellent compost bin material. All you have to do is cobble together 3 or 4 sides, put something on the top if you want to, or leave it open. At my house, I have nothing on the top. It's wide open. I just have 4 pallets that I cobble together, you know, with some wood, and that's all you really need. You know, you can do 1 of those, you can make 2 of them, you can make 3 like we have here. Doesn't really matter as long as you have at least 1 to get going. I would recommend if you can make 2, you'll definitely have a better system, because then you can at least turn your compost once and you'll be able to let it fully break down before you put it out into the garden or underneath the tree, or, you know, give it to your neighbors, whatever you want to do with it. So incredibly easy to make, and honestly so much more functional than most of the compost bins that I see being sold for, you know, oftentimes these bins go for $100. The bins that you have to turn that are raised off the ground and barrels, some of you may have seen those, I find them to be extremely ineffective, as well as the bins that are covered in plastic on all sides. Those bins tend to fall apart. They're not as good with allowing aeration. So all sorts of issues with those. So really, you know, in a matter of an hour or 2, you can create a bin that will last for years and years that you can make for essentially nothing. So that's really what I would recommend if you're looking to make a bin in your yard. Any other questions about compost bins or our compost system here? I want to offer a couple other alternatives for folks as well.
Not right now, so
okay,
go
great.
ahead. And everybody, please feel welcome to submit questions, and we'll pass them on to Dan.
Great. So I want to offer a couple other ways that you can compost. So come with me. I'm going to walk over to one of our garden beds.
We actually do have another question.
Yeah, sure.
Should we stay away from pressure-treated wood?
That's a great question. So if you are building a compost bin, ideally I would say yes, stay away from pressure-treated wood. Most pallets nowadays are heat-treated rather than pressure-treated. So most of them are fine to use. But if you're buying lumber, yeah, generally I would stay away from pressure-treated. Either use something that's fully natural, or you can use a rot-resistant wood. You know, something like cedar, but of course will be more expensive. I generally don't use really fancy materials. So whatever you can find for cheap, you know, if you need to rebuild it every 5 years, that's okay. I mean, these are so easy to build. You're just building a box or a circle of some kind. You can even just put some posts in the ground and put some hardware cloth or chicken wire around it. Whatever you have that you can create at least a 3x3x3 bin, that's all you need to get started. So don't spend a lot of money, but yes, if you can avoid pressure treated, I would. So
Great.
let's say you don't want to make a bin, but you still want to compost. Well, one thing that I often do in my garden is I compost right in the pathway of my garden beds. So you can see here, we're in one of our vegetable garden beds. This is going to be planted out to potatoes in about a week or so. Our potatoes are going in quite late this year. And what we can do, if we wanted to, let's say we're coming out here with our kitchen scraps every day or 2 or week or so, we could just put them in the pathway and just kind of create what's called a trench compost. So you can dig out your pathway a little bit, like so. Layer in your kitchen scraps and then cover them with some brown material. And you can see our brown material is already here. We have some straw that was last year's mulch. We have some leaves from the tree that's behind me here, some branches, whatever you have. And I'm just gonna layer that over my pretend kitchen scraps there. And every time I come out, I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna move on to the next little spot there, put some in, cover it up. And then you can walk on it, it'll break down right in place. And the amazing thing about that is that it'll actually allow the nutrients to seep into your garden bed. So you'll actually be feeding your plants as you compost, right on the spot. And then in a year or so, it'll be fully decomposed. You could actually shovel out your trench, put that soil, that compost, right on your garden beds or wherever you want it, and start the process again. So the con of this method is that because you're not building up that big bulky bin, it's going to take a lot longer for those materials to break down because you're not going to really be getting a lot of thermophilic bacterial action in there. You're going to be relying mostly on worms and on fungi to break down that material. They're a bit slower they're slower decomposers. But if you don't really care about the time scale, absolutely, this is a fantastic method. And the other downside I should mention is that if you do end up, adding some oily materials, or even sometimes with just regular kitchen scraps aside from oil or dairy or meat, you will occasionally get squirrels or rodents burrowing in and trying to get to that, food that you buried for them. So if you're not concerned about that, go for it. This is a really passive, easy, free way of composting right in place. I also want to talk a little bit about vermicomposting. So vermicomposting is essentially a way of composting using worms, specifically red wiggler worms. Now, I don't have a physical example to show you right now. We did have a worm composting setup here last summer that we used for a while. But for our context here, it doesn't make quite as much sense because we produce a lot of organic material from the garden. But if you live in an apartment or in a city where you don't really have access to an outdoor area, you don't have a yard, worm composting is a great way of cycling nutrients indoors and creating really, really good fertilizer for your house plants or something that you want to give away to somebody else who's a gardener maybe. Worm composting really means you have to have access to some kind of a bin with really good drainage. What we used here was a 5-gallon bucket that we drilled holes just using, I think, an 1/8-inch drill, drilled holes all around and on the bottom, and we stuck it into another 5-gallon bucket. And that allows for good drainage because worms don't want to be sitting in really wet conditions. Then we put some shredded paper right on the bottom, and we put a couple of scoops of finished compost and soil in there as well. They need some soil to get started. After that, all we did was we would add small chunks of our weeds or kitchen scraps right in there for the worms to decompose. We usually would add, maybe a couple pints at a time. We wouldn't want to overwhelm them. And then we would cover it with a little bit more shredded paper or some soil, either one. And at that point, they start to decompose and to really digest that material. The beautiful thing about worm compost is that the final product will be the perfect plant food. I mean, you really can't get anything better than worm castings to feed your plants. If you just give a little tiny bit of worm castings to your house plants, to your outdoor plants, they will absolutely love it. So it's even more nutrient rich than regular compost that we're making here. It's just incredibly nitrogen rich. It's incredible material because worms are just really, really good digesters, particularly red wiggler worms. They're able to digest many, many, many times their weight in food every single day. But the downside is that you have to be much more picky about what you're giving them. There's a lot of things that worms don't like. They're not a big fan of onions, for example. They're not a big fan of large chunks of food. They don't really like eggshells very much. There's a lot of things that you really can't give them or they'll just won't break down. And in general, you have to just take more care of them. So if you're okay with doing that process, then worm composting is a great way to go. And you can keep a worm bin right underneath your kitchen sink. You can keep it in your basement. Really, all they need is a room temperature or slightly cooler than room temperature environment that doesn't freeze any time of year. So here, we don't have access to a really good indoor space, which is why we composted using worms over summer. We tried it out, and certainly we got some great compost out of the process, but it just didn't really make sense for us because we didn't have a place to keep them in the winter, and we were just producing far too much. We didn't have time to fuss with the worms. But if you want another kitchen pet, then I would highly recommend worm composting as the way to go. And we're going to send around some materials about vermicomposting afterwards so that you can get started if you're interested in doing that. Again, it's really easy, it's cheap. You can use materials that you can find for free or for really cheap at any kind of hardware store. So great option for those who don't have a lot of space or for those who are looking for a really, really, really high quality final product that they can give to their plants.
Dan, do you do anything? Do you do anything different in the wintertime? Are you still putting kitchen scraps or anything into the compost bin during the winter?
Yeah, great question. So I do in my home and here in the garden, I'm always adding more material. In the garden, we don't have quite as much to add in the wintertime because it's fairly static here. But certainly at home, I'm always cooking, so I always have kitchen scraps to add, and I use the exact same system. The only difference is that in the winter, you are not really going to see much decomposition. It's going to be fairly static, and then once spring comes around, it'll really start to rev up again. So follow the same protocol, 3 parts brown to 1 part green, and keep adding to your bin. Make sure you have enough space to get you through that winter, right? Otherwise, you might need to build a new bin or make a bigger bin. But yes, certainly there's no reason to stop composting in the winter, just with the recognition that it's just going to pile up for a while and you're not going to see a lot of change until the weather warms up. And once the weather warms up, it's amazing how quickly things really rev into gear. The first thing that you'll notice is that your bin will dramatically reduce in size because as things start to break down, everything just shrinks. What seems like a large pile will probably get to about a 25% volume of the original in a matter of a month or so in the spring once things start to really warm up. It's amazing how it shrinks down. So what you'll end up with is a lot less compost than that original pile size because everything will break down. But you can really kind of watch that happen really, really rapidly. So yeah, keep piling things up in the winter, and as soon as it gets warm, just check on it, make sure it's moist enough, make sure that looks like it's fairly uniform. If you want to turn it a little bit at that point, that'll certainly help as well. But otherwise, yeah, you can absolutely continue throughout the winter. And I did want to also mention one tip for really, really rapid and good compost processing is to try to keep your particle size small as possible. I generally try to avoid adding big branches, sticks, whole loaves of bread right into the compost, not because they won't break down, certainly they will, but because they'll take a long time to do so. And again, I'm looking for really rapid results because I want to cycle those nutrients, get them right back into the soil as quickly as possible. So if possible, try to keep your particle size down by either, maybe chopping things up or breaking things up a little bit by hand when you're in the kitchen. Or if you're adding things, the brown materials, try to avoid large, bulky materials like sticks and branches. If you're pulling out giant weeds, I usually chop them up into smaller pieces, which will help them break down faster. And speaking of weeds, really important tip. A lot of people ask me, Can you put weeds into a compost? Won't they just sprout more weed seed when you put them back out into your garden? If you have a really well-balanced carbon to nitrogen ratio, you're actually going to burn up those weed seeds. They're going to get to a really high temperature because of that thermophilic bacteria, which renders them inactive. They won't be able to sprout after that. So you can feel safe about putting weeds, even with weed seed right down there, into your compost bin, so long as you are getting that nice thermophilic action. So if you are not sure if you're getting that balance right and you really, really want to avoid getting more weeds in your garden, you may want to avoid putting weed seeds right in there unless you can be sure that you're really monitoring it and that it's going to be a nice warm pile. Any other questions? So I'm curious to hear from folks, what is preventing you from composting in your life? Really interested in what your hesitations might be, whether it's sort of how it fits into your daily routine, or potential issues that you might be fearful of, whether it's rodents or smell or anything else that we haven't addressed. Maybe landlord questions, how to explain to your landlord the benefits of composting, anything along those lines. I think one of the most important steps that we can take towards a truly sustainable lifestyle, it's really, I think, on par with driving less. It's an incredibly important step, something that is really empowering. I found that once I started composting at home, it just really changed my whole mindset in thinking about nutrient flows and thinking about how we cycle things in our economy. And you really start to just have this shift in your perspective. It also just is incredible if you have children, and particularly, or as an adult, to just watch the amount of life that compost brings into your garden, brings into just even that bin where you're creating that compost. I mean, it's unbelievable how much richness, how much biological life is in that one bin, just scraps that you're throwing in there.
So if you're not doing a whole lot of gardening, what can you do with the compost if you're composting just to be more sustainable?
Absolutely, great question. So even if you have a tree or a shrub or any plants in your yard, put them around your those trees or shrubs as a mulch, especially in the springtime or in the fall. It'll look really nice, it'll look beautiful, it'll help those plants thrive, and then you don't have to worry about it. The other thing you could do is if you have a grass lawn, one of the best things that you can do for a really rich, beautiful, lush lawn is to top dress it with compost once a year. This is something that all organic landscapers are doing nowadays. It's really the best thing that you can do for your lawn, aside from also aerating it a little bit, is just sprinkle some compost. Not to the point where it buries the grass. You don't want to do that. You don't want to smother it. You want to just top dress it. So a very thin layer, maybe a 1/4 inch, even less perhaps. I often just use my hand and I'll just sprinkle it around the grass, right? Really haphazardly, not a whole lot of thought to it. And that really will feed your lawn for the course of a whole year and will prevent all sorts of potential pest issues. It'll also lock that carbon in place. So you're doing your part to actually mitigate climate change by just spreading compost on grass. And we know that it's one of the most important things that we can be doing to really regenerate our landscapes now. So really easy to, and of course you can also give it away, but honestly the easiest thing to do is take it outside and just scatter it wherever you have any open space.
And is there a good time of year to do that, or is that any time?
I mean, really, any time of year you can get around to it is fine. If you really want to hone it in, generally early spring is the time that most landscapers and gardeners will be doing that before grass really starts to take off, because that's going to feed them early in the season and that's going to carry them throughout the entire growing season. But really don't worry about it. It's about creating that rhythm for your life. So whenever you have finished compost, if you need to free up that space, just toss it around. And don't worry about it too much. We add compost all over this garden whenever we can. So whenever we have finished compost, we'll bring it out. Before we plant anything in the garden, we pretty much always add compost. Not only is it providing fertility for your plants, it's creating soil structure, it's reducing the amount of watering you have to do because it acts as a sponge, it's helping drainage, it brings in soil biology, which will cycle all nutrients through, which will create more plant health. So there's a lot of reasons why we add it in. And we put it around our perennials whenever we can as well. So you can't even see it here, but we actually added compost around here last fall, created a nice mulch ring. So whenever we can, we're putting it out, always finding places to use it. If you have a raised bed, top it up with compost whenever you can. You can add it as a mulch to reduce weeds around plants. Whatever you can do with it, it's always going to be beneficial to add to any landscape.
Is there any other troubleshooting advice you for composting?
Yeah, so let's just kind of go over what we want to. So if it's smelling bad, that's either anaerobic, meaning there isn't enough aeration in there, and that can be remedied by just turning your pile, or there's not enough brown material. Those are the two potential causes of bad smell. So if not enough brown, just add some more in as you turn your compost or as you're able to mix it up a little bit. If it's not breaking down, that's either too much brown or not enough water. If you're having rodent issues, that generally means that you either have some oil or meat or dairy in there. That could be remedied by using some hardware cloth to protect your bin and also reducing the amount of oil, meat, dairy that you add in there. So I would generally recommend, if you're going to want to protect your bin, to use 1/2-inch mesh or smaller. A mouse or a rat can fit into a 1-inch opening quite easily. So you really want to make sure you have something smaller than that. I would really recommend trying to protect it on all sides. The other thing I want to add, actually, just as a quick helpful tip, if you're getting really slow processing, one thing that I find really beneficial is to actually add some finished compost or really high quality topsoil into that bin as you're making it. So oftentimes I have a finished pile of compost next to one that I'm layering in the process, and I'll take a little bit of that finished compost and I'll just sprinkle some in occasionally as a little bit of a layer. And what that's really doing is you're kind of inoculating your pile that you're creating with all of that rich bacteria and fungi, earthworms, nematodes, arthropods, everything that's in that finished compost, you're adding into that new pile, and that really kind of just gets them going really, really quickly. So I find that to be extremely helpful. I also often will just top the top of the bin with a little bit of finished compost or soil. And again, I just find that really helps the whole process go really, really quickly. So a few tips there. The other thing I really recommend is monitoring moisture more than anything. I find that that's really the biggest issue at home, is that people have dry compost and it just sits there for years and years and years. So make sure that you're monitoring that moisture. That's the first thing I'd be looking at as you get in there. But otherwise, it's really quite easy. And again, I want to reiterate, everything breaks down. All organic materials will break down. So even if it takes a year, just let it do its thing. When it's done, put it out. So don't worry too much about the speed. As long as you're composting, as long as you're diverting those nutrients and creating a really rich organic material that is just so incredibly useful, that is really the black gold for all plants, for the whole cycle to really renew itself. That's the most important thing.
Great. We got a comment that says, honestly, if it's a convenient bin in my office, like the trash and the recycling, I would definitely develop a habit. I think it's the perception of smell in a small office setting that makes it hard.
Absolutely. And that is really challenging. And I know that here at UMass, they're really trying to work out the efficiency, the logistics around compost pickup in offices and in residential halls. And it is challenging. Yeah, it is actually challenging. I would say that, I would like to see us as a culture get to the point where composting is as second nature as recycling is right now. For 20, 30 years ago, recycling felt like a really big step for us. At this point, for many of us, I venture a lot of people who are on this Zoom call right now, it feels like second nature to put something into a recycling bin. And at this point, if you start composting, in a year or two, I promise you, it will feel like second nature. Of course, when you're at work, that's a different story, right? It's much more challenging to bring your own bin to work, right? Most people don't want to do that. So yes, we absolutely need to be figuring out institutional logistics to making sure that we can pick up our compost to cycle those nutrients on site here. And I encourage you all to advocate for that in your office with your manager, whoever it might be. Excuse me, whoever it might be. If you don't have composting, ask for, don't be afraid to be an advocate, because that's what we really need to start making these shifts culturally. Great question.
We're out of time. If anybody has any additional questions, please send them our way and we will respond quickly. And thank you everybody for coming to join us in the garden virtually. And thank you, Dan, for all of the rich information that you shared with us today.